Hey, everybody, it's Doug Green, and I'm the publisher of Technology Reseller News. And I'm very pleased to have my good friend Jon Arnold with me. Jon, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome, Doug. Always good to be doing a session with you. And we got a fun one today. I'll just have a quick shout out, though, before we start. In your little bumper video clip, I just love the way the globe turns and just settles right on Canada. Good
Well, there
call.
you go. Oh, Canada. Oh, my. All
There you
right.
go.
And you are,
Right.
in fact, actually, for as a point of reference, because we like being very accurate in our podcast, of course, you're, in fact, in Toronto today.
Yeah, for a change, but only for a day. So, yeah, the travels continue. So I'm glad we could catch this in before going on another trip. So timing is good.
You guys have had a snowy Toronto, a snowy winter, I think.
Yeah, big thaw today though. The weather has really warmed up, so I think the
That's
snow is
nice.
done, but we'll take it. But it's been cold for sure. It continues to be cold, but today it warmed up.
Well, today we're going to be talking about redefining unified communications for AI voice. 5 threads, 1 story, and in fact, this is the presentation you gave everybody last week at the vCon Spring Conference in Frisco, Texas.
Yes, so we our paths cross yet again. So it's worth just putting a bit of a shout out there for Jeff and his sister Lauren, and of course Thomas McCarthy Howe and the vConic Foundation. This is the epicenter of the vCon movement, which I think is an accurate way to describe it, Doug. Right? I mean, we're talking about something that isn't quite in the market yet, but the momentum is building and all the groundwork is being laid by these folks to get this concept of vCon to a point where it can become an IETF standard. And what they're thinking is much like the way SIP, when it became a standard, kind of kickstarted the VoIP space, the time is right again. And as we all know, for Jeff, it's all about voice. And now this is like the next iteration of where voice technologies are at, right?
And before we move on, it's probably good for us to define a term. What is vCon?
Oh, don't ask. I don't know. Actually, nobody really knows. So vCon is virtual conversations, and the idea is to create basically a containerized approach where digital communications, which they will call conversations, which makes it sound like it's just voice, but we can have text-based conversations too. We can have video-based conversations, but the idea that when they're digitized and they have the filter of AI to organize it, extract value from it, create new things from it, now that voice has a lot of value. So that's why we're talking about conversations are kind of like this, this stream of data that can be turned into new forms of value. And the idea for a vCon is, I think Thomas uses this analogy, which I like, of thinking of it as a PDF for conversations. In other words, it's a safe place where all forms of communication can be stored and accessed and protected. So it's also a bit of a blueprint or a fingerprint, really, for the genesis of a communication. So in other words, if you need to prove that I said this or you said that, this happens to be really important in regulated spaces, right? Where you've got to prove something happened. This is kind of becomes your, so to speak, system of record for communications, which they're calling conversations. It's a little verbose, and believe me, folks, this is about as fast as I can distill it. Doug, we've been around this thing, but nobody has yet come up with a 5-word definition of vCons.
Well, in that light, let's dive into the topic that you presented and the slides you presented last week. So let's pull those up, put them on stage.
Yes.
There we go. And Jon, to basically take it away, we want to basically offer everybody literally a synopsized version of the presentation we got to see last week. It was really good. Everyone was paying great attention to it.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So I put this together, and I kind of co-presented with my longtime partner Chris Fine. He and I have been doing, if you don't know or watched the Space podcast for many years, And Chris and I often collaborate because we just go back so long with so much of this technology. So we don't need a lot of preparation to do these things. And we've done this at other Jeff Pulver events. And so the idea here was, in the program itself, they had the kind of like the keynote sessions, and then the afternoon were the breakouts. So they had a couple of different tracks. And Jeff asked me, if I could do a talk about AI voice in one of the breakouts. So the focus of this, so tying the pieces together, that's what I call this 5 threads. So unified communications, it's kind of its own thing. AI voice is becoming a dominant trend in the whole enterprise communication space. And then where does vCons fit with all this? So I'm going to kind of go through this now with the highlights of where I kind of see all these things fitting together. So it's interesting because unified communications is important because that's where enterprise communications lives. But interestingly, Doug, you probably have seen this too. Most of the action with AI voice and a lot of like the agentic applications in the AI space are really happening in the contact center space, where CX is kind of the driver for everything. And there's a lot of use cases in that space for these newer technologies driven by AI, a little less so in the UC space, but it's still important. So that's what we're going to get into here. So let me pull a few of these slides through here. So 5 threads. So first, I want to talk about my presentation from the Enterprise Connect event, which happened a couple of weeks prior, and I'll explain why that's relevant here. Then we'll talk a bit about AI voice, then how UC and AI voice kind of fit together, and then layer onto that CPaaS, which is another one of the cloud platforms that are very important to this space, and how they're looking at the AI voice space. And I'll tie all that together with a focus on vCon. So I'm going to step back in time a couple of weeks, not that long ago, but I did a couple of sessions at Enterprise Connect, which is, of course, the kind of ground zero event for the enterprise communication space. So I'm going to start by not talking about AI voice and giving a different spin to what's happening in the UC space with AI. So my panel track, one of the new tracks they introduced for Enterprise Connect, as you know, Doug, was called Future Shock. And they wanted us to look at emerging technologies and where things are going. So not to talk so much about what's happening today, but looking a little further out. And of course, that takes us back, Doug. We all remember this, 1970, when this book came out. Oh, I should have run out to the counter to get it. I have it. I have my original copy from 1970. It's pretty faded. But that book was, I would think you'd agree, Doug, was the first book that was like one of those like mega trends, right, big brain thinking things that make you question everything, right?
Right.
Yeah, we all remember that book. And so I took a quote from it just to provide some context. As you can see it here, it's the dizzying disorientation brought on by the premature arrival of the future. All right, the language might sound a little over the top there, but Doug, if this doesn't describe AI, I don't know what is.
Well, right? and perspective also for those of us who are actually old enough to remember this even as a kid. This is the dawn of digitization, 1970, that era. Large organizations are really, really, really for the first time. Computers have been around for a while in the 50s and so on, but now utility companies, phone companies, large organizations are really basically adopting computers to do billing, to do practical business things and so on. And they're actually human beings, regular people, office workers are starting to more and more actually interact with automation.
Yeah.
And I think, by the way, John, for our telecom audience, I think, and someone will maybe correct me, I think it's 71 or 72. It's around this time, the first automated PBX, the first with a switchboard with no attendance, basically shows up. So this is like not a big deal today, but this was astounding technology then.
Well, and just the move from, rotary dial to DTMF to the push button phones. And I even remember back then, if you wanted push button, you had to pay, I think, an extra $2 a month for that capability, for the advanced digital tools that it provided. So it maybe seems laughable by today's standards, but I love reading stuff that's either futuristic or science fiction based, that's written in a time before the digital age came and computers were a thing. This was
Right.
before we had anything like that. So we're thinking of this purely in a human context. And some of it's alarmist, of course, but some of it, the thinking, people don't think like that now because they're so conditioned by technology.
Right.
So that's another topic unto itself. But so why am I talking about this? So my focus in my presentation was about where communications is going with AI. And yes, voice is important, but what's really happening is P to M and M to P, right? Person to machine and machine to person communication, where AI is becoming so prevalent that we have to, if we're going to work side by side with AI, as that's the intention, we have to communicate effectively with AI. And you don't need to do it just with voice. There are other modes of communication. So my thinking here is I'm expanding the definition of communication beyond human to human or voice, but there are other ways to communicate that are, basically nonverbal. And this is kind of how the future work is going. And I could speak all day about this. So I cited these 4 basic kind of modes that I think people understand. So you have things like ambient interfaces. So this is what I call the post-PC era, when we don't need physical endpoints anymore, but basically connectivity, I call it hyperconnectivity, will be built into everything around us, tabletops, walls, windows, all surfaces will just be a touch away from having this. So you won't need a computer at all. So that's the ambient, where basically the technology is everywhere. Haptic is another big one. If you're a gamer, you know what haptic is all about. If you've played Wii, that's haptic, right? You're holding a wand type of thing. It's really interesting technology. Gesture-based communication, right? Where you just wave a hand or you blink your eyes. Digital twins and Centaur systems. I'm not going to get into what these are all about, but I think you kind of can sense where they are. And this is a lot of it's IoT stuff, right? Right, Doug? I mean, this is really like humans aren't terribly involved with this, but if we're going to interact with AI, these modes in the future of work are going to be, I think, just as important as voice. We're not there yet, but it is happening. Some of it's in the consumer world, right? With gamers especially, they understand this stuff. But when you think about other things that you could be doing, this gets really interesting. So to make it a little more real, so I'm talking here about being at Enterprise Connect. This is my world, folks. Then I was at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. Well, that's a gigantic show, and it makes Enterprise Connect look like a small show, to be candid, but that's not relevant. Anyways, wandering the show floor, and there are 8 halls. This place is really big. I managed to find the Israel Pavilion. And at the Israel Pavilion, the Israelis always have great technology. So I found this one company called Mudra, and they're not the only ones in the world doing this stuff, but at least I got a real in-person demo. And as you can see on the slide, which I took while he was giving me the demo, he's wearing this bracelet, right? So that's a haptic device where it's the sensoring is all coming from his body. And much like a Wii, he's directing on the screen in front of him what's happening. And it's pretty cool. And I think with a lot of new technologies that are kind of outside our norm, once you get the idea of what it is and how it works, I think, Doug, you'd agree, the use cases will come, right? Right now, a lot of this is in the IoT world, especially in like manufacturing, industrial settings, the Honeywells of the world, IBM, but Cisco, Microsoft, they all have big investments in these technologies, but they're not really in the enterprise space yet. But I think they will find their way. So why is this relevant? My panel session where I moderated, I had speakers. You may even recognize these people, but Ring Central, Zoom, and Dialpad, leaders in the UC space. While I'm talking about this stuff, they weren't on the same page with me. These guys were focusing primarily on what's happening right now in the market, and that is AI voice, right? So that's fine. So their position was, no, it's all about voice right now. And I wouldn't argue with that, but this is a future shock track, and I'm thinking about what's coming next. And so my takeaway from all this is if you're not thinking about these things, that's going to be the next wave of innovation once AI voice kind of becomes table stakes for everybody, because then everyone's going to have it. You're going to have to get something else after that. So that's where I think this is going to go. So right now, yes, this validates the voice is the big thing. That's great. But I'm also thinking a little more down the road as well. So I wanted to bring that into the conversation, since we are talking about virtual conversations, and they may today just be voice and text, but you know what? Down the road, that vCon, bubble might include some of these other modes too. We'll see. Okay, so that's thread 1. Thread 2 is this term you're hearing a lot of, AI voice. That's a kind of a bit of a mashup of terms. Some people call it voice AI. Also familiar, other examples would be, bots, agents, virtual assistants, agentic AI. So there are a lot of terms to describe what we mean by AI voice. But really what we're talking about here is the next acronym, Doug, of many, of course, is speech to speech. And why AI voice is important is normally we get to voice with AI through some form of a translation application. So it's usually some form of text to speech or speech to text, where there's that layer in the middle between two speakers that has to translate back and forth. When you take that out, it becomes speech to speech. And that's kind of like becoming a big thing now in the AI voice space. And why it's important is because this term dark data that I've been using for quite some time, and it describes all of the conversations that go on in the workplace, in particular, that have not been captured yet by AI and digitized tools, right? So that's what's coming next. So because much of it has not been captured yet, there's a big kind of gold rush on right now to get all of these conversations digitized, so AI has more basically fuel for AI to drive their LLMs. So now what this is really getting to is, if you're a telco in particular, stop talking about calls, stop talking about telephony. It's really about the conversations. That's where the value is. So, the kind of the general term is, whoever controls the conversations, controls the market. So that's where the technologies are going to. So that's my view on this thread 2. And just my slide here is just about some of the benefits. When you can do all these things, AI adds all this that we couldn't really have before. Intelligent automation, hands-free comms, which is obviously important for some scenarios. We got this out of the COVID era, right, where you had to have touchless. Multilingual, doing it in real time. That's a big breakthrough. 24/7, of course. The analytics that comes through with AI for QA and compliance, that's a big addition. And it also helps make for a more inclusive, accessible workplace. So I think there's good drivers for this to be in the market to help UC evolve. Right. And then another driver, of course, for the UC players is that the space is very crowded and mature, and it's very competitive. And as I said before, they're going to need new growth vectors. So these technologies all kind of flow into it, but also enterprises need AI roadmaps. They need help. Workers are going to need to be upskilled to do this stuff right. So if you can kind of bring this AI voice concept to the market effectively, it's helped solve a lot of these problems. It's a use case for AI, and it makes workers more productive and more comfortable using AI. All right, so there's our thread there. And just very quickly, why I'm talking about this in the AI space for UCaaS, is that it's in the market now. So RingCentral, for example, has their kind of new suite, AIR, ACE, AVA. Zoom has ZVA, Zoom Virtual Agent, Cisco, Infobip, etc. All of these vendors have these offerings in some form or another in the market now. But you look at this list, Doug, and as you see, it's mostly for contact center, mostly CX. Right. So UCaaS is important, but if you really want to get to the center of the action, CCaaS is really where most of the stuff is happening. I mentioned Infobip in here for a reason, because they're really more of a CPaaS player. And again, that's another kind of driver for adopting these innovations. This slide, of course, will be impossible for you all to see, but it's a good example of how messy the AI voice ecosystem is. There's, a lot of players, a lot of money funding a lot of startups that don't have any track record. Very difficult to evaluate this. And I wouldn't ask anybody to do this on their own. You really need someone with AI voice expertise to sift through this, to figure out if you're going to go down this path, you better understand what you're getting into, because it's really fast moving and just way too many companies for any human to follow. Another great use case for AI, right, Doug? Have a bot.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to say,
Right.
how would anyone organize that in their mind?
No, you can't. And that's again where the channels come in, right? There will be experts who can help with this. I'm citing this, by the way, from Sierra Ventures through this CPAS Association report. I'm going to get to that in the next thread, so I'll hold off on that. So that brings us to this. So if you don't know, this is the CPAS Association, and
Que pasa?
Que pasa? Okay, that's right. Que pasa?
Que
So
pasa?
that's Rob Curvers, and I think who's the other guy? Is it Kevin Northcott?
Yeah, Kevin Othercutt.
Yeah, that's it. So these guys are, and I know Rob is based in Amsterdam, but they're the champions for this CPAS space. And
Rob Gallup.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So these guys are driving different types of innovation, but with the same technology, right? So again, I think of UCAS, CCAS, and CPAS as kind of like the three-legged stool of cloud. And I think this space is really just as important. So they just published this report. It's about 70 pages. It's very dense, and it's publicly available. So I don't have to tell you, it's not hard to get, and I'm not stealing anything out of school that I shouldn't be saying.
No.
But that's the title page of the report. Not hard to find. You can always follow up, folks, with us after to get the link. But I just want to share a couple of slides to provide a little more context for how they're viewing the AI voice story. So again, I'm not going to get into the details here, but the big idea for this slide is how we talk about the full life cycle of a call, right? Or conversation, right? So, and many of the cloud vendors talk like this as well. They talk about this range, this spectrum, pre-call, in-call, post-call. And at each stage of a conversation, there are certain needs and applications where AI comes in. So this slide is a nice summarization of some of the things at each stage of the call. So like in the contact center space, they talk about the customer journey. And this is a bit like that too, where you look at the whole picture, not just one leg of it, because there's value opportunities in all of these three spaces. So the report goes in a little more depth to this. So I just thought it was a good visual to bring in. And similarly here, where the value comes, right? And it starts the far left, as it says here, transactional improvements. Okay, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit, the today stuff that happens. But as you kind of get further along using AI voice applications, you kind of go up the ladder a little bit. So now you can start looking at these quality improvements and then the holistic improvements. So basically you're moving from like tactical to strategic, right? So over time, and it shows some, a timeline at the very bottom of the slide, how long it's going to take. But this is how business leaders, IT leaders need to be thinking about, what are we going to do with this AI voice thing? And where does vCons come in? So that's going to be the fifth thread here. Okay, and vCons. I think this is the last slide, Doug. Tying it all together. So as I mentioned earlier, what SIP was to VoIP, vCon is to AI voice. So that's where it ties together here. If you're thinking about AI voice, you should be thinking about vCon. Why? Because it's interoperability. So anybody who's been through these earlier generations of technology breakthroughs in the comm space knows, you got to move away from proprietary systems, which proved to be the death of the PBX, like you mentioned PBX earlier, Doug, right?
Right.
Without interop, you have just these islands, and it's the workplace. Every network environment has to be interop now. It's the only way you can share applications, right? And then the other thing is with voice, why it's so important is it keeps AI human centric, right? Because if we move away from voice altogether, AI is going to develop its own language that we're going to have to kind of kowtow to. So I've mentioned all three platforms and how voice does make them better. And yes, ops for both vendors and service providers. And I do want to do a small shout out here, Doug, to Dean Bubley, who also ran a breakout session like this one. And he did a great job outlining the service provider, the telco opportunity, where this really comes in to help their businesses evolve. So But you did a segment on him too, right? So I'd steer readers to that one if you want to see what the telco opportunity is. Yeah, and then to tie that off, there are some basic caveats that we don't have time to touch on, but of course, there's risk to every form of innovation. So here, of course, privacy and security issues are a big deal. Compliance. So there's this term compliance by design. And this is
Right.
how you have to start thinking with AI voice. You can't tack it on later as something, it's like a checkbox thing you have to do for the regulators. You have to really think about this because, like I said, with the non-verbal forms of AI earlier. Not yet there yet. I'm just trying to say in the non-verbal forms, we open up so many more kind of streams for AI to interact with us. That creates a lot more kind of leakage points that can be problematic with compliance. So you got to think in design terms to build it in from scratch to make sure you cover yourself. And this is a whole other topic, of course, but the AI regulations, where the U.S. is not terribly regulated at this point. And there's a lot of state level issues and conflicts. And we saw a taste of that, I think, Doug, from Glenn Richards, giving his usual take on the regulatory space from the legal community. So that's messy stuff, but we're not going to get to that today. So that's the thread 5 on that. I think that's it. And just one more visual from the CPAS AA report, just the way they look at vCon. There's a nice section in that report. I think it's around page 65 that touches on how they view vCon as part of it. So this is just a visual to show how they are trying to articulate that. And that, I think, is the last slide. Yes, so that was from the event itself, but that's actually from an earlier Jeff Pulver event with Jeff. Anyway, so that's that. So I think we're through it.
John, if you wouldn't mind go back a one or two slides, because I want to. There it is. Stick with that for just a second, because my little brain didn't go beyond this, because I think this one comment or statement here is huge. Not that everything else isn't, but what SIP was to VoIP, vCon is to AI voice. And so I hope, I don't want to hold us up here, but for people who didn't live through it, SIP was quite a revolution in terms of pushing VoIP along, if I remember that correctly.
Well, yeah, because again, the standard needed to be in place for it to be taken seriously and to get the big vendors to, continue investing in it. It was still scary to the telcos. They did everything they could to keep it out.
Yes.
It was such a threat to their business.
So it's interesting. Let's stick with that for a second, because I think we're seeing maybe some of the same behaviors a little bit. So, large organizations that had huge investments and were making good money in providing services in, if you will, the previous regime, saw SIP as not a good thing for them. But if I'm remembering it correctly, it's part of what it broke down those fortress silos, isn't it? Isn't SIP what really blew all that up?
Yeah, right. So it was less dependent on a legacy network.
Right, you weren't stuck within Avaya or Nortel or something anymore.
Right. Yeah.
As much.
Yeah. Now, as long as the phones were SIP enabled, they could talk to each other.
So explain to me how then so vCon is to AI voice. How is that the same revolutionary thing?
Yeah, because again, it's a standardized approach so it doesn't matter what the type of a conversation it is. It doesn't matter what type of a network you're on or what type of an endpoint it is. If it all kind of gets containerized in the same kind of systematic, I guess, architecture, and I'm not the IT guy to explain it, Doug. That's what we need Thomas for. But it's that taking that standardized approach from the bottom up that says, okay, we kind of know where AI comes in to make use of all of this. But if we're going to unearth all of these communications, which no human can manage them all, like Jeff likes to talk about, think about your emails. We all have maybe hundreds of thousands of emails. We'll never be able to manage all of that. But what if, an AI tool could review all of your emails, pull out the gold? And they talked about this too. It might have been Dag Peak from Alianza talking about how there's this you think of it as gold, right?
Yeah.
And you're panning for gold in a river, and you pull all these little nuggets out, and they have value. But if you just watch the river go by, there's no value because you can't even see the gold. But if you
Right.
pan for it and find a way to extract it,
That was
that's
an
the same
interesting
analogy.
analogy.
Yeah, to
Yeah.
say, okay, we know there's value in there. So like that's Jeff's big thing. I know there was an email from 10 years ago and it was really important, but
Right.
I'll never, but if it's all in a vCon, it's, it's archivable, it's searchable. So AI's got the horsepower to go through unlimited numbers of interactions and sessions. And that's beyond what humans can do. So rather than just leave it all to, to your archive folder that you never will look at again, it kind of brings it back to life, right? And so I think I do think there's value there. Now to be more objective about all of this too. Now because it's so hard to explain, Doug, people are having a really struggle to understand. Well, what the hell is this? And I keep asking the vendors, what is vCon doing that your AI capabilities
I
currently?
do too. Yeah.
And I still struggle with that a bit because I guess vCon isn't really addressing a problem that is viewed as a problem right now. I think as AI just keeps exploding the amount of data we have to manage, and as compliance, right? Remember I said compliance by design. As compliance requirements become more stringent, there's just going to be more needs to have a more manageable approach to this. And that's where I think vCon can be a really key part of the of the solution. But really to get IT folks to care about it, we had some dialogue about this after the session. It's not sexy, right? It's not something, it's like insurance. I really don't want it until I have to have it.
Right. Right.
So if you're okay, why get excited about it? And ultimately I think it's got to be tied to risk, right? If you're going to have AI running everything in your organization, to me, there's a lot of risk to that. And I think vCon could be part of the way you manage that risk certainly on the compliance and the privacy sides of things. But you have to get past that and say, okay, yeah, if we kind of de-risk it, what are the benefits? And I bullet pointed a few of those benefits earlier. When you start thinking along those lines, now this AI voice thing starts to become a little more, more real, right? And vCon should be totally in the background, right? No one should have to think about, is it vCon or, I think about it like Intel Inside, right? No one's going to look under the hood, but it's almost like a seal of approval or of credibility for the communications. And I think that's where they want to get to.
John, as we close up our podcast, I think you just said something very interesting there. And I'm wondering if that's not true about all huge technology leaps forward, is that they didn't necessarily solve a problem that everyone was laboring under, but they created something new that afterwards everyone felt that they needed and was necessary. And I'm thinking about every type of technology, including things which are we don't often think is technology. Human beings function just fine without an automobile. Now all of a sudden you need an automobile. You need access to one, or you need to own one, or need to rent one, or get in an Uber, right? We're dependent on automotive technology, trucks, and so on. We have created a technology which now we find necessary. And I'm wondering if that actually, does vCon actually rise to that type of leap forward?
Well, I think it helps make the marriage between AI and communications more meaningful, right? Because AI, we normally think of it as a tool for automation, which is fine, and maybe cost reduction. But for creating new value, making the workplace more productive, that's a different kind of focus on AI. But to do that, you've got to be able to tie all these things together. That's why I say these 5 threads. It's not just one thing. It's kind of looking at this whole bigger picture and understanding it. And this is where the Thomas McCarthy House of the world, they live and breathe this 24/7. So we're just watching it from the sidelines. But if that level of passion kind of comes out and others start to see it, then it gets interesting. Because as I said earlier, figure out the technology first, which is what they're doing. They're hardening it now to scale. The use cases will absolutely follow. whether it comes from the UCAS players I mentioned earlier on that Enterprise Connect panel, or from some place completely outside of our industry, and I wouldn't count that out for a second, that could come in and say, hey, let's do this, this, and this, and they'll have a new approach to this stuff, and then it will just run.
Jon, I really want to thank you for joining me today and presenting to our audience basically a great summary of the presentation you made at the vCon conference. A lot of thought-provoking things. I hope we get to actually do a series of podcasts on each of the topics, in a sense, each of those slides. I think we could unpack. But for now, Jon, where can we learn more about what you work on at J. Arnold and Associates?
Sure. I'm fairly old school, so the website is kind of the home for most of what I do. But I will tell you, so that's jarnoldassociates.com. But on a more regular basis, you can follow me on LinkedIn. My feed is pretty easy to find. And if you get to my website, you'll see I have a monthly newsletter that you could sign up for in about 5 seconds. The podcast will come back to life soon, Doug. But you can find me also on many channels, including TR News, where I'm a contributor. And so not hard to find at all. And we'll certainly be at my share of events over the next little while. And always happy to hear from people and meet up if the time works out.
And as you can see, I've been fooling around putting up the little vCon Foundation logo up during the presentation. A little shout out there to Jeff Pulver and Lauren Pulver and Thomas Howe, all the folks basically at the vCon Foundation that are making this thing possible.
Yeah, and
Thomas McCarthy Howe.
Yes, McCarthy Howe. And to be fair, folks, this is kind of how innovation works. Nobody is getting rich doing this right now. Right. Jeff most people are doing this of their own volition, free time. No one's getting paid. But a lot of people feel strongly enough that this has some legs. So you check this out, folks. You're watching it from the ground floor. And, when Jeff gets fully behind something, he's usually right. No guarantees, but I think this could be, this could validate a lot of what he's been backing for quite a while now. So stay tuned. The big thing to watch for is if this becomes an IETF standard, then that we're at the starting point for this thing.
Absolutely. Well, Jon, again, I'm looking forward to actually doing those additional podcasts. But for now, thank you very much indeed.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Doug. Thanks everybody for listening and watching, and we'll see you soon.